It is August 28th, and 104 years ago today, on August 28th, 1916, Italy declared war on Germany. That's a very odd event for a number of reasons. One is that Italy had already been at war for 15 months. Another is at the outset of the Great War, Italy had supposedly been aligned with Germany, part of the so-called Triple Alliance. And the events that would drive Italy to finally declare war on Germany in 1916 were intimately tied to the complex diplomacy of the Great War era, the history of Italy, and one of the war's least remembered and least understood fronts, and would go on to impact the role that Italy would play in the next war. It is history that deserves to be remembered. To understand the Italian position in the Great War, you have to go back a century to the 1814-15 Congress of Vienna. Following Napoleon's abdication and exile to Elba at the end of the War of the Sixth Coalition, the great European powers met between November 1814 and June 1815 to create a long-term peace plan that resolved issues remaining from the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. While it had its detractors, in many ways the Congress was largely seen as a success that prevented a large-scale war in Europe for nearly a century. However, Italy, at the time a group of disparate states, was not one of the four great powers whose decisions controlled the Congress. Being generally a conservative and anti-revolutionary group, and chaired by an Austrian, Prince Clemens von Metternich, the final act of the Congress restored the patchwork of independent states on the Italian peninsula, and placed much of the Italian-speaking part of northeastern Italy under the control of the Austrian Empire. Almost immediately following the decisions of the Congress of Vienna, there was opposition in Italy, which is part of a growing nationalist and liberal movement that was moving throughout Europe. The first revolts came as a liberal response against King Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies in 1820. Fearing the movement could turn into a broader liberal movement, the so-called Holy Alliance of Prussia, Russia, and Austria intervened. This was a precursor to a growing movement for Italian nationalism that led to the Risorgimento, three successive Italian wars of independence, wars in which Austria was a common adversary of the Italian nationalists. After 3 wars in 18 years, ending in 1866, much of Italy had unified as the Kingdom of Italy under the House of Savoy, but had developed a strong enmity towards Austria, which had not only consistently opposed unification, but still held regions in northern Italy that Italian nationalists believed should be part of a unified Italy. However, by 1882, different interests had arisen. Italy, like other European nations of the time, was seeking to set up an overseas empire, and colonial ambitions in Africa put them at odds with France, which had generally been an ally during the Risorgimento. Having just won the Franco-Prussian War, Prussia was a natural ally against France, but Prussia was aligned with Italy's long-term rival, Austria-Hungary, and so King Umberto I set aside long-standing differences and joined the so-called Triple Alliance with Prussia and Austria-Hungary. The Triple Alliance was a defensive alliance in which all 3 members promised to come to the military aid of another member if they were attacked by a great power. It had specific provisions. For example, it said if Austria-Hungary went to war with Russia, that Italy promised merely to remain neutral. And as both Austria and Italy had territorial designs in the Balkans, they agreed that they would consult each other before either one of them would take any actions that would shift the balance of power in the Balkans. Between September 1911 and October 1912, Italy fought a war with the Ottoman Empire over control of Libya. The brief Turco-Italian War had a large impact on Italy, being far more costly in men and finance than had been planned, while stoking internal divisions. But it had perhaps a larger impact on Europe. Italy's victory against Turkey betrayed the weaknesses of the Ottoman Empire, emboldening nationalism among Balkan states and resulting in 2 successive wars in the Balkans. And instability and nationalism in the Balkans would have grave consequences for Europe. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary concluded that the assassination was supported by Serbian nationalists and issued an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23rd. The ultimatum demanded a harsh crackdown on Serbian nationalists. Both Austria-Hungary and Prussia knew that Serbia would not be able to meet the terms of the ultimatum, and as Russia would likely come to Serbia's defense, the ultimatum might lead to general war in Europe. Despite a flurry of diplomacy and lack of enthusiasm for war by many of the major powers, no compromise could be reached on the ultimatum. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28th. As a response, Russia announced it would mobilize its forces on July 30th. The Russian mobilization led Prussia to mobilize. During a 2-front war, Prussia demanded that France renounce its alliance with Russia or be invaded. That caused France to mobilize. Prussia declared war on Russia on August 1st, France on August 3rd, and Belgium, which would have to cross to invade France, on August 4th. Britain declared war on Prussia on August 4th to protect Belgian neutrality. In a matter of just a few days, Europe had fallen into a general war. But what about Italy? Despite the Triple Alliance, Italy remained neutral. The alliance was a defensive alliance, and Italy saw Prussia and Austria-Hungary as the aggressors, thus not requiring Italian support under the alliance. Moreover, the alliance had required prior consultation before any member changed the status quo in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary had not consulted Italy before issuing the Serbia ultimatum, in Italy's eyes a violation of the terms of the alliance. Italy had reasons for not getting involved. Still a relatively young nation, Italy was not yet fully industrialized. In the period between 1910 and 1915, industrial output accounted for only 25.6% of gross national product. Its army of 300,000 was poorly trained, poorly armed, and wholly inadequate compared to the so-called great powers. Still largely an agricultural nation, it lacked the industrial base to finance war and was still in debt from the war with Turkey. And entry into the war was largely opposed by the nation's business interests. The nation was still struggling with the social impacts of the Risorgimento as well as liberalization, including expanded suffrage. There were large economic and social disparities between the agricultural South and the industrial North, and competition among the factions representing the Socialists, the Catholic Church, and the Nationalists. The Turco-Italian War had given rise to large anti-militant factions, and when 3 anti-militant protesters were killed during a demonstration by police, it led to a week in mid-June of riots and protests and general strikes that destroyed much of the infrastructure in central Italy. The anti-militant socialists were fighting in the streets with the militant nationalists, and eventually the army had to be called in to restore order. The public was overwhelmingly opposed to entry into the war, but there were other forces on both the far left and the far right pushing for entry. Some wanted to respect the Triple Alliance in order to win territorial gains from France, and others instead pushed to join the Entente, as the most prized territorial aspirations of the nationalists were Italian-speaking sections of the north that had been under Austro-Hungarian control since the Congress of Vienna. Nationalists and some narrow business interests supported war as a means of territorial gain. While the Catholics and socialists largely opposed war, some socialists, including the influential journalist Benito Mussolini, came to support war. Mussolini saw war as an opportunity for socialists to oppose what he deemed to be the reactionist governments in Prussia and Austria-Hungary. His support for the war eventually resulted in his expulsion from the Italian Socialist Party. In essence, the Kingdom of Italy entered into a bidding war between the Central Powers and the Entente powers over who would offer the most territorial concessions in exchange for Italy entering the war on their behalf. It was a policy that Prime Minister Antonio Salandra termed sacred egoism. The government also hoped that going to war would bring together the competing internal interests that were leading to social unrest. By March 1915, Italy had come to an agreement with the Entente called the Pact of London. Italy agreed to leave the Triple Alliance and join the Entente, promising to declare war on both Austria-Hungary and Prussia within the month. In exchange, the Entente promised financial support from Britain and, assuming Entente victory, gains of territory from Austria-Hungary to Italy's north, as well as certain islands in the Asiatic. Salandra was ecstatic with the agreement, calling it the greatest, if not the first spontaneous act of diplomacy by Italy since the Risorgimento. But the details of the pact were kept secret and didn't become public until 1917 when they were revealed by Bolsheviks in Russia. But the pact was not popular at home, and parliamentary opponents managed to force Salandra to resign. However, the king, Victor Emmanuel III, intervened, refusing to accept his resignation and stipulating that Italy was already committed to the pact. And so Italy was brought into the war against the opposition of the military, the majority of parliament, and the will of the bulk of the population, although pro-war supporters flooded the streets. But despite the pact requirements, when Italy declared war on May 23rd, they only declared war on Austria. Their hope was to prevent Germany from supporting Austria. In a telling statement about Italy's reason for intervention, Italy referred to the war as the Fourth Italian War of Independence, thus outlining the Italian motive of fulfilling the goals of the Risorgimento and gaining back the Italian-speaking territories that had been handed Austria in the Congress of Vienna. The Italian front in World War I represented some 400 miles of largely mountainous terrain that quickly bogged down into a stalemate, which was much like the trench war on the Western Front, but only at very high altitudes and with very cold winters. Italy declared war on Ottoman Turkey the following August, citing mistreatment of Italians in the empire, although it was probably more connected to Ottoman attempts to raise local rebellions against Italian rule in Libya. But Italy still avoided declaring war on Germany, even though German troops were defending parts of the Austrian line. This led to another oddity. In September of 1915, Germany suspended its U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, afraid after outrage at American deaths from the sinking of passenger liners would draw America into the war. But the U-boat activity continued in the Mediterranean, where there was less American shipping. German U-boats preyed on Italian ships, but as they were not technically at war, the U-boats would attack under an Austrian flag. In November 1915, the U-38 sank the Italian passenger liner Ancona, killing 208 people, including 25 Americans. Once again, the Americans protested, but this time to Austria. But still, Italy did not declare war on Germany. Rather, that had to do with another territorial bribe. Romania had remained neutral during the first 2 years of the war. Negotiation with the Allies had stalled because of long-standing tensions between Romania and Russia. In August 1916, Romania finally agreed to join the Entente in exchange for food supplies and support for territorial claims against Hungary. Romania transmitted the declaration of war on August 27, 1916, causing Prussia to declare war on Romania. 15 months after declaring war on Austria, Italy finally declared war on Germany in support of its ally, Romania. While German troops had participated in defensive actions along the Italian front prior to the declaration of war, they had largely refrained from taking part in offensives. Germany provided extensive reinforcement to Austrian troops in the October 1917 Battle of Caporetto, which has been called the greatest defeat in Italian military history, leading to some 40,000 casualties and 265,000 troops taken prisoner. Still, the offensive stalled, and Italy was able to press back and cause the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army during the 1918 Allied 100-day offensive. Italy's belated declaration of war against Germany 104 years ago today demonstrates the complexity of that conflict and the many different motivations of the nations that were involved. In the end, Italy joined a war that its people did not want, that it could ill afford, for reasons that were very different than the reasons that the other great powers were fighting. The war came at great cost for Italy. Some 650,000 Italian soldiers died. Another 950,000 were wounded. To finance the 148 billion lira cost of the war, they had to take loans from allies that weren't paid back clear until the 1970s. In the peace after the war that was negotiated at Versailles, the collapse of their rivals, Austria-Hungary and Prussia, cemented Italy as one of the great powers, but they were unable to secure all the promises that had been made in the Pact of London. This largely had to do with the United States, where President Woodrow Wilson had a specific view of post-war Europe, and of course he had not been party to that pact. But the failure to fulfill all the terms of the Pact of London led to outrage in Italy over what they called the mutilated victory. That would be a significant propaganda point for the nationalists that would help to give rise to Italian fascism under the former socialist Benito Mussolini, and that would set the stage for Italy's role in the next war. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long, and if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.